On what should have been the happiest night of their lives, a newlywed couple vanished without a trace. No witnesses, no clues, just silence. For 15 long years, their disappearance haunted an entire town, until one hiker stumbled upon something deep in the forest that would finally unravel the mystery. What happened on that wedding night? And why did the truth stay hidden for so long? You won't believe how it all ends. But before we dive into this gripping story, tell me, where are you watching from? Drop your location in the comments below, and let's see how far this story travels. Now, let's begin. Asterisk. The sun cast its golden hue over the ridges of the Blue Ridge Mountains, painting the skies in hues of lavender and rose as the soft hum of cicadas welcomed the evening. On that late summer afternoon in August of 2008, the town of Wailing Gap came alive with joy. It wasn't often the whole town gathered in celebration, but this day was special. Emily Sanders, a local girl known for her laughter and boundless kindness, was marrying Jake Monroe, the quiet, steady-hearted mechanic she'd fallen for back in high school. They'd been inseparable since the 10th grade, and everyone who knew them agreed. They were meant for each other. The wedding ceremony took place on the edge of a forest, clearing behind an old stone chapel that had stood since the 1800s, its ivy-covered walls now witnessing another chapter of love and hope. Guests filled white chairs beneath strings of twinkling lights that swayed gently in the warm breeze. Emily wore her mother's lace gown, slightly altered but still full of history, while Jake stood tall in a navy suit that his younger brother Matt had tailored for him. As she walked down the aisle, her eyes never left his. And when they read their vows spoken with a tenderness that left more than a few teary-eyed, the world seemed to pause for them, as though nature itself acknowledged the promise being made. After the ceremony, the celebration spilled out into a meadow nearby, where long wooden tables were lined with fresh wildflowers and hand-labeled jars of sweet tea and lemonade. There was laughter, dancing, and music that floated out into the trees. The couple shared their first dance under the stars to a song that Jake had secretly written and recorded with the help of his musician cousin, a soft melody that told the story of how he'd fallen for a girl who once slipped him a note during algebra. It was the kind of wedding people remembered, not for its extravagance, but for its heart. Everyone spoke of how genuine it felt, how you could see their future written in every glance they gave each other. As the evening wound down, guests lit sparklers and formed a glowing archway for the couple to walk through, showered in cheers and well wishes. Emily's best friend, Sarah, gave her a tight hug before they left, whispering something only Emily could hear, and the two women laughed through their tears. Jake shook hands with his father, a man who rarely showed emotion, but this time clapped his son on the back with something close to pride in his eyes. They drove off in a restored red convertible that Jake had spent a year rebuilding, cans clinking behind them, and "just married" written in elegant white script across the back window. Their destination was a secluded honeymoon cabin tucked deep in the forest, a place chosen specifically for its quiet and its charm. Owned by a family friend, it sat on the edge of a private hiking trail and overlooked a still, peaceful lake. The drive took them about 45 minutes, winding along country roads that gradually turned into gravel and then dirt as the forest grew denser. When they finally arrived, the cabin looked like something out of a storybook, timber-framed with a wraparound porch, a porch swing swaying gently, and soft light from lanterns glowing against the wood. Inside, it was cozy, with hand-carved furniture, quilts folded neatly at the end of a rustic bed, and a fireplace stacked and ready for lighting. Emily twirled around the room, barefoot, laughing as Jake chased her, scooping her up and laying her gently onto the bed. They talked for hours about the future, about their hopes, about starting a family someday. It felt like a beginning, like they had all the time in the world. But sometime after midnight, as the rain began to fall, first gently, then with more force, the lights flickered and then went out completely. A power outage wasn't unusual in the area during storms, and the couple made the best of it, lighting a few candles and curling up by the window, listening to the wind rustle the trees. The forest, normally peaceful, now sounded alive and uncertain, every branch snapping or howl of wind seeming louder than before. Emily pulled Jake's arm tighter around her. "Feels kind of spooky out here, doesn't it?" she said with a nervous laugh. Jake smiled and kissed her forehead. "It's just that the storm. We're fine." They fell asleep eventually, wrapped in each other's arms, their wedding bands still shining in the candlelight. But what neither of them knew, and what no one could have guessed, was that this night, so full of love and promise, would be their last. The next morning, no calls would be made, no breakfast cooked, no signs of life from that tiny cabin in the woods. When Emily's parents didn't hear from her, they assumed the couple was enjoying their privacy. When Sarah's text went unanswered, she told herself Emily had just turned her phone off. But by the following day, the silence would start to feel heavy. The convertible would still be parked outside, untouched. And inside the cabin, everything would look exactly as it should, except for the most important thing. Emily and Jake would be gone. Morning broke slowly over the mountains, casting pale light across the damp forest and streaking gold through the clouds left behind by the storm. At first, no one thought much of the silence. It was only natural, they assumed, that the newlyweds would want a day to themselves. But as afternoon rolled in and Emily's mother found herself staring at the silent phone on the kitchen wall, she began to feel something unfamiliar stir in her chest. She'd told herself not to hover, to let a daughter enjoy her first full day of married life, but the quiet was stretching too long. When Sarah called to ask if Emily had texted her, and her voice held a subtle quiver that wasn't there before, the unease turned into something colder, something sharper. That evening, when no one could reach Emily or Jake on their cell phones, and when the owner of the cabin, a friend of Jake's family, confirmed that he hadn't heard from them either, Emily's father made the call. By nightfall, a sheriff's deputy had driven the winding road up toward the cabin. He expected to find the couple safe, maybe laughing off a dead battery or a forgotten charger. But when he arrived, what he found was stillness. The red convertible sat right where it should have been, parked neatly in the gravel, its windshield speckled with dried rain. The door to the cabin was locked. When he knocked, no one answered. He circled around the porch, checked the windows, peered through the glass. Everything inside appeared untouched. He radioed for permission to enter and then carefully stepped inside. The smell of old wood and damp fabric met him immediately. On the table sat two untouched mugs, one with a dried ring of tea at the bottom. A single candle had burned all the way down, the wax puddled beneath it. Emily's wedding dress, delicately folded, lay on a chair near the fireplace. Jake's wallet sat on the knitstand in the bedroom, next to a half-read book and the watch. He never took off except when sleeping. There was no sign of a struggle. No broken glass, no signs of forced entry. But there was something strange in the air and absence, a kind of eerie emptiness that settled into the corners of the room like dust. He stepped back outside and called it in. By the next morning, the search had begun. Search and rescue teams from 3 neighboring counties mobilized quickly. The terrain was familiar to many of them, but the forest was vast, filled with steep ridges, hidden ravines, and long-forgotten footpaths. Helicopters circled above, while dogs were brought in to pick up scents from the couple's clothing. Volunteers combed the trails, calling out their names until their voices grew hoarse. The searchers fanned out in all directions from the cabin, forming grids, checking every thicket and hollow. But day after day, the woods gave back nothing. A few muddy footprints were found near the edge of a stream about a mile away, but they were quickly washed out by rain. At one point, a shredded piece of cloth was found snagged on a branch, but it wasn't linked definitively to either of them. The lack of any clear signs only deepened the mystery. Rumors began swirling among the townsfolk, passed around like folklore reborn. Some said the storm might have spooked a wild animal that attacked the couple. Others whispered that perhaps Jake had led Emily into the woods for some tragic reason. A darker few suggested they might have staged their disappearance run off to start a new life. But for those who truly knew them, none of it made sense. Jake wasn't the kind of man to abandon family, and Emily had never once shown signs of hesitation about their life together. They were grounded, steady, and loved deeply. The idea that they would simply vanish by choice was absurd to those closest to them. Still, the human mind searches for answers in the absence of truth, and the town of Wayland Gap soon became divided, some believing in tragedy, others in mystery, and some in the kind of secrets no one dare speak aloud. Meanwhile, the families hung between hope and heartbreak. Emily's mother stopped sleeping, pacing the living room at night and keeping the porch light on. Jake's father, once a firm believer in logic and order, grew obsessed with maps, tracking every creek and outcropping near the cabin. Sarah, shaken and guilt-ridden, started recording everything she remembered from the days leading up to the wedding, every conversation, every glance, trying to find a clue. But no matter how deeply they searched, the same answer echoed back from the trees. Nothing. 2 weeks after the disappearance, the official search was scaled back. Authorities cited budget constraints and the lack of new leads. The families were devastated. Friends of Emily and Jake kept the search going privately for months, but as winter approached, the forest grew more dangerous, and eventually, even the most hopeful had to concede to the harsh stillness that had swallowed them. The cabin was closed up, its windows shuttered, its doors locked. It stood like a frozen relic of a moment that had turned to ash. The car was eventually towed away, the dress kept by Emily's mother in a cedar chest she could barely look at. The sheriff's department filed it as a cold case. In the quiet that followed, the world moved on mostly. But for those who had loved them, time did not heal. It only froze, keeping their last memory of Emily and Jake locked inside that summer night, waiting for an answer that wouldn't come for 15 long years. In the weeks and months that followed the disappearance, the Sanders and Monroe families were plunged into a kind of grief that didn't follow rules. There was no body to bury, no final words to cling to, only the unbearable quiet of not knowing. Every day was a delicate balancing act between hope and despair. Emily's mother, Linda, became a ghost of herself, moving through the house as if everything might break if she moved too quickly. She stopped cooking, stopped playing the piano, and took to standing at the kitchen window with a cup of untouched coffee growing cold in her hands. She stared toward the road, as if willing her daughter's car to come around the corner. Emily's father, Richard, tried to stay strong, holding on to routines like they were lifelines, fixing the porch steps, mowing the lawn, cleaning Emily's room as if she were just away on a trip. But sometimes, late at night, when he thought no one was listening, Linda could hear him crying behind the garage, the sound of a man trying not to be broken. Jake's family wasn't faring much better. His mother, Elaine, who had once been full of life and charm, barely left the house. She folded and refolded Jake's childhood clothes, placed his childhood toys in boxes, and rearranged them endlessly like it might change something. His younger brother, Matt, stopped going to college classes and moved back home, blaming himself for not driving Jake to the cabin that night, thinking maybe, just maybe, it could have been different if he had. But it was Jake's father, Walter Monroe, who took the loss in the hardest, most complicated way. a retired military officer with sharp instincts and an even sharper sense of duty. He simply couldn't accept that two healthy, capable people could disappear without leaving a single trace. He pored over maps and terrain reports, requested copies of police files, and even hired 2 different private investigators over the span of a year. When the officials gave up, he didn't. He retraced the hiking paths, questioned local hunters, even dug through online message boards, looking for any mention of an encounter, a sighting, a theory. But the deeper he dug, the more the silence screamed at him. He began to take it personally, like the forest itself was mocking him. And soon he started to blame others, blame the sheriff's department for not acting faster, blame the cabin's owner for not checking in, blame himself for not warning Jake about how isolated that place really was. The emotional toll rippled outward from the families into the community. Friends stopped knowing what to say. Some avoided the topic altogether, while others offered well-meaning but hollow comfort. People said things like, everything happens for a reason, or maybe it's better they're together wherever they are, not realizing how much pain those words could cause. Sarah, Emily's best friend since grade school, became obsessed with keeping Emily's memory alive. She created a scrapbook that turned into a journal and then into a binder full of theories, clippings, and timelines. She rewatched videos from the wedding, pausing them at random moments to see if any background face seemed unfamiliar. She visited the cabin once, despite her parents begging her not to go. She said she needed to feel the air, to walk where her friend had walked, to understand. What she found was something she couldn't describe, an emptiness so thick it settled into her bones. The trees felt too quiet. The cabin door, though locked, seemed to whisper that it had seen something unspeakable as the first anniversary came. And when no new leads had emerged, the town of Wailing Gap began to move forward, as towns do, because time insists on passing whether hearts are ready or not. New couples were married in that same chapel. Babies were born. Businesses opened. But for those connected to Emily and Jake, the world had dimmed. Holidays were no longer celebrations. They were reminders. Christmas stockings went unfilled. Birthdays passed with no candles to blow out, and the laughter that once echoed through. Their homes became memories that grew more distant with each passing year. The grief changed shape over time. It stopped being loud and weeping and became quiet and private, tucked away like a photograph you can't bring yourself to look at, but can't bear to throw away. The Monroes and the Sanders drifted apart in their sorrow, the shared pain too heavy to carry together. Conversations grew strained, visits less frequent. At some point, no one could remember whose silence had started it. And still, through it all, Sarah kept searching. In secret at first, then more publicly. She created a website about the case, uploaded videos of their story, even reached out to true crime communities hoping someone, somewhere, might have seen something. She gave interviews, talked to podcasters, and never stopped mentioning the storm, the power outage, and the stranger Emily had once mentioned seeing at the rehearsal dinner, a man who had stood too close, smiled too long. It was a passing comment at the time, but now it lived rent-free in Sarah's mind. She held on to that thread, thin as it was, because it was better than having none. And she continued to dream of Emily, sometimes hearing her voice in the wind, sometimes waking up in tears, sometimes seeing flashes of her in crowded streets, only to blink and realize it was someone else. Hope is cruel in that way. It does not let go easily, even logic is long since surrendered. 15 years is a long time to carry a question that has no answer. It ages people in ways mirrors can't always show. It hollows out parts of the heart that can't be filled. But it also forges something in those who remain, an unspoken promise to remember, to keep the light on, to keep asking why. For the families, there were no milestones anymore, only markers of how long it had been since the world made sense. The world had moved on, but they had not. And deep in those mountains, in the place where the storm once rolled through, something waited. Silent, hidden, patient. Wayland Gap was not the kind of place the world paid much attention to. Tucked quietly between folds of the Blue Ridge Mountains, it had always been the sort of town where life moved a little slower, where neighbors knew each other's grandkids, and the church bell still rang at noon. But after that wedding night in 2008, everything changed. Not overnight. No, it was more like the shift in seasons. So gradual, it's almost imperceptible until one day you wake up and realize the air smells different. At first, there was disbelief, the kind that grips a small town when something tragic happens close to home. People gathered at the diner and at the gas station, whispering over coffee cups and pickup truck hoods, trying to make sense of it all. They asked the same questions in 100 ways. How could two young people vanish so completely? How could no one have seen anything? Was there someone dangerous still out there, watching? The forest had always been part of their lives, something familiar and dependable. But now, the trees seemed to lean in a little closer, and the shadows lasted just a bit longer. As time passed, the story of Emily and Jake settled into the town's bones. Children who had been too young to understand at the time grew up hearing fragments of the tale. The wedding that ended in silence, the cabin no one returned from, the search that yielded nothing but more questions. It became the kind of story told at campfires and sleepovers, the kind that teenagers dared each other to reenact by sneaking up to the old trailhead after dark. But for the adults, for those who remembered the faces of the missing and had attended that bright, joyful wedding, it wasn't a ghost story. It was a scar. And even though new faces moved into town and life continued in all its ordinary ways, the memory of that loss remained a part of the landscape, as steady and unshakable as the mountains themselves. The cabin, once a cozy retreat, known to hikers and honeymooners alike, fell into a quiet kind of ruin. No one stayed there after the disappearance. The owner had it boarded up, claiming maintenance issues, though everyone knew the real reason. It stood, weathering the seasons, as vines crept over the porch railings and leaves gathered thick on the roof. The curtains inside were drawn and never moved. Some said you could still see the candlelight flickering in the windows if you passed by at night, though no one could ever prove it. The road leading up to it became overgrown, rarely traveled. Still, every now and then, someone would leave flowers on the cabin steps. No one ever admitted to it, but the gesture remained like a quiet heartbeat, a sign that someone still remembered, still cared. Every few years, the story would resurface. A true crime blogger would stumble across the case and write a post filled with theories and speculation. A podcaster might do an episode, drawing on the details that had become folklore. Some treated it with respect, others with a ghoulish curiosity that left locals bitter and wounded all over again. The sheriff's office received occasional tips, usually anonymous, always vague. Most turned out to be nothing, but they reawakened the old ache each time. A few filmmakers even approached the families over the years, asking to turn the story into a movie or documentary. All were turned away. It wasn't entertainment. It was real, and it still hurt. The town itself tried to honor the memory in quieter, more sincere ways. On the 10th anniversary of the disappearance, the town council organized a candlelight vigil on the chapel grounds where Emily and Jake had said their vows. Dozens of people gathered, holding flickering lights against the darkening sky, sharing stories, singing soft hymns, and standing in silence together. Sarah spoke that night, her voice steady but her hands trembling as she held a photograph of her and Emily in their teenage years. She spoke of laughter, of dreams they'd had, of the life that was supposed to follow that wedding day. And though her words were quiet, they carried the weight of a decade of unanswered questions. That vigil became an annual event, small but meaningful. a thread of remembrance that kept their names from fading entirely. Despite everything, the people of Whalen Gap never gave up hope completely. Some believed the couple had gotten lost and perished in a place no searcher had reached. Others thought something darker had happened, that someone with terrible intent had stumbled upon the cabin that night. A few clung to the desperate belief that Emily and Jake had somehow survived, fled, and were living somewhere else under new names, waiting for the right moment to return. But whatever their personal theories, most agreed on one thing. The forest had swallowed something that night, and until it chose to give it back, peace would remain just out of reach. In the quiet of the evenings, when the fog rolled down from the hills and settled over the rooftops like a memory, the people of Whalen Gap often found themselves thinking about that young couple, about the way Emily's eyes had shone when she walked down the aisle, about the smile on Jake's face when he turned to see her, about the love that had been so palpable, so real, it had seemed to fill the entire chapel with warmth. It was that memory, not the mystery, not the fear, that lingered most powerfully. Love, after all, has a way of holding on, even when everything else has let go. 15 years later, it would take a hiker straying from the path to shake the town from its long-held sorrow. But until that moment came, Whalen Gap waited, not with impatience or anger, but with a kind of reverent stillness, like someone sitting beside an empty chair, hoping that one day the person who left it would return. The story had become part of the town's soul, and in the hush of those mountain nights, you could almost hear Emily's laughter in the rustle of the trees, and Jake's voice in the wind that wound gently through the hollows, reminding everyone that some stories don't, and they only sleep. It was a quiet morning in early October, 15 years after Emily and Jake disappeared, when Tom Walker, a retired park ranger with a limp in his left leg and a fondness for solitude, set out on a hike he hadn't taken in over a decade. The mountains had always called to him more than people did, and now, with his children grown and his wife long gone, he spent his days wandering old trails and forgotten clearings, listening to the world breathe. That morning, the air was crisp, the leaves a cascade of amber and rust beneath his boots, and the smell of damp earth hung in the air like something ancient and honest. He was not following a marked trail. He rarely did these days, but instead tracing a path he remembered from years ago, one that cut through the deeper woods near the old wedding cabin, now little more than a ghost in the trees. The path was overgrown, choked with brambles and fallen branches, but Tom moved slowly, patiently, his walking stick tapping rhythmically against the forest floor as he pressed forward. He wasn't looking for anything in particular, only the comfort that came with being swallowed by the woods. But something caught his eye just as he crested a small rise, a glint of metal in the underbrush, something unnatural among the roots and leaves. He paused, squinting, then stepped off the trail, crouching carefully. There, nestled between a cluster of stones and tangled roots, lay a small rusted locket, its chain broken, its surface worn but still faintly engraved with 2 letters, E.J. Tom stared at it, heart suddenly thudding with the weight of recognition. He remembered the story, of course. Everyone did. The couple who had vanished, the wedding night that ended in mystery. He reached out and picked it up gently, brushing away the dirt. It felt cold, heavier than it should have. A quiet chill passed through him, not from the air but from something deeper, something he couldn't explain. He stood up slowly, his eyes scanning the surrounding woods. Just ahead, he noticed a strange rise in the ground, like something had shifted long ago and the forest had grown up around it. He moved toward it, driven by something unspoken. As he reached the edge of the rise, he saw it a weather-worn piece of fabric half buried under moss and leaves. Kneeling again, he cleared the debris and uncovered the corner of what looked like an old suitcase. It was leather, the stitching long unraveled, but still mostly intact. He hesitated, then opened it. Inside were water-damaged remnants of clothing, the faded outline of a photograph torn nearly in half, and a journal swollen from moisture but still whole. He could make out a few words scrawled in shaky ink on the inside cover. "If someone finds this, please." The rest was smeared and unreadable. Tom didn't touch anything else. His years as a ranger had taught him when to stop, when to call for help. He marked a location, turned back the way he came, and hiked back to the ranger station without delay, the locket clenched tightly in his hand the entire way. When he walked into the station, the younger rangers on duty looked up in surprise. Tom hadn't checked in for weeks. But when they saw the look on his face, all casual greetings fell silent. Within the hour, the sheriff's office had been notified. Within the day, a forensic team was on site, roping off the area and combing it inch by inch. And before the week was out, the news had broken after 15 years. Something had finally been found. The discovery sent shockwaves through Wayland Gap. The local news aired the story every hour. People came to the edge of the trail, hoping to catch a glimpse of the search teams. Reporters set up near the ranger station, whispering theories and speculations. But beneath the noise, there was something solemn in the air, like the mountain itself was holding its breath. The families were contacted immediately. Linda and Richard Sanders sat together for the first time in years, the weight of the phone call pressing on them like a tidal wave. Walter Monroe, now in his late 60s, gripped the armrest of his chair as he listened, jaw clenched, saying nothing until the caller finished. Then he simply said, "Tell me where," and hung up. Sarah wept when she heard. She drove up that night, alone, parking her car outside the station and sitting in the dark, staring at the mountains until dawn. The forensic team worked tirelessly. Near the suitcase, under a layer of dirt and fallen leaves, they uncovered bones. Two sets, side by side, partially embraced as if the people they once belonged to had clung to each other in the end. Items found nearby included a woman's sandal, a wedding ring still on a delicate finger bone, and a pocket knife rusted with time. The locket, confirmed to be the same one Emily had worn on her wedding day, matched the initials. Dental records confirmed what many already suspected. Emily, Sanders, and Jake Monroe had finally been found. Not alive, not returned, but no longer lost. Their story, for so long suspended in silence, had begun to speak. There were no cheers, no celebrations, only quiet and tears and long, lingering embraces. For the town that had waited and wondered for so long, the truth was a kind of release. For the families, it was a wound reopened, but also a wound that could finally begin to heal. Tom Walker, the man who had stumbled upon it all, declined interviews. When asked why he'd been in that part of the woods, he only said, "I guess they were ready to be found." And with that, he returned to his quiet hikes and gentle footsteps, leaving the noise to others. But deep in those woods, the silence had shifted. Something once hidden had come into the light, and nothing in Wayland Gap would ever be quite the same again. The excavation took 3 days. No one rushed. Every brushstroke against the soil, every slow sweep of earth over bone or fabric, was done with the quiet reverence reserved for sacred ground. The forest was hushed, as if nature itself knew to hold its voice. Police tape stretched between trees, creating a perimeter that seemed almost ceremonial. Journalists were kept at a distance, their lenses hungry but denied. This was not a spectacle, it was a recovery. And what they uncovered in those woods began to unravel a story that had long been lost to time, a story whose details had been whispered in theories, but never truly known. As the layers of dirt gave way, investigators found not just the skeletal remains of 2 people lying in a shallow depression side by side, but around them, the scattered fragments of a night that had never made sense. The suitcase had yielded. Its first clues, a half-destroyed wedding photograph, water-stained but unmistakable. The photo had been torn clean through the middle, the rip jagged, as though it had been yanked apart in haste. One half showed Emily, her smile radiant, a smear of cake on her cheek. The other half was missing. Beneath the photograph was a small bundle of cloth, carefully folded and tied with a red ribbon, inside of which lay a slim, waterlogged book, a journal. The ink had bled across most of the pages, and parts were unreadable, but a team of forensic archivists began the delicate task of restoring what they could. They would later say it was one of the most haunting documents they had ever held. Early pages were filled with the joy of a new bride, Emily, writing about the ceremony, her laughter at Jake's shaky hands during the vows, her disbelief that the day had finally come. She spoke of the beauty of the mountains, of the way the wind carried their laughter into the trees, of how it felt to fall asleep beside the man she had loved since she was 17. But soon, the tone changed. Halfway through the journal, the writing grew rushed, uneven, with lines that spilled into the margins and paragraphs that trailed off. One entry simply read, "Someone was outside the cabin tonight." Another, the ink smeared by what looked like water or tears, described how a man had knocked on the door in the middle of the night asking for help, claiming his truck had broken down. Jake, always quick to offer a hand, let him in. Emily had written, "Something about him felt wrong." His smile never reached his eyes. "I didn't want him here. Jake says I'm just tired, but I don't feel safe." The next entry was more frantic. "He's still here. Says he wants to stay until morning. Jake tried to get him to leave, but he won't. I think he's armed. We're pretending everything's fine, but Jake whispered that we'll sneak out once he's asleep." The final legible page contained a few scattered words, broken phrases. "Running. We're in the woods. He followed. I don't think. We'll make it if someone finds this." And then nothing. The remaining pages had been torn out or destroyed, perhaps by weather, perhaps by intent. The journal was enough, though. Enough to piece together a terrifying picture of that night. And it was enough to reclassify the case from missing persons to homicide. Investigators re-examined the scene with new focus. Just beyond the bodies, buried beneath years of forest debris, they found a rusted hunting knife. Forensic analysis, though limited due to the time and exposure, confirmed blood traces consistent with one of the victims. They also found a partial fingerprint on a shard of the broken suitcase frame, preserved by sheer chance in a layer of dried mud. The print was entered into national databases, and within 72 hours, a match was made. Clayton Ridge, a convicted felon, released from prison in July of 2008, just weeks before Emily and Jake's wedding. His record included burglary, assault, and threats of violence. After his release, he had failed to report to his parole officer and had disappeared off the radar. Authorities now believe he had been drifting through the area, living in the woods or squatting in abandoned buildings. Somehow, fate placed him on that path the same night Emily and Jake arrived at the cabin. The horror of what must have happened that night began to take shape. A man with nothing to lose, slipping into the life of two people at their most vulnerable. Perhaps he intended only to rob them. Perhaps something snapped. But whatever happened, the outcome was clear. Emily and Jake had fled, likely injured, into the darkness of the forest, trying to outpace something unspeakable. And there, alone and afraid, they died together. The forensic report noted their positioning arms partially around each other, as if clinging to the only comfort they had left. Exposure, hypothermia, possibly wounds sustained in a struggle. The cause of death could not be conclusively determined after so many years, but the conclusion was unavoidable. It had not been an accident. It had not been a choice. It had been a crime. The revelation sent new ripples through Wayland Gap. The legend, once softened by time and uncertainty, now had a face, a name, a predator. The knowledge brought anger and grief all over again, but also something else. Justice, however, late, however, incomplete. Walter Monroe, upon hearing the findings, stood silently for a long moment and then whispered, "I knew he'd never leave her." Linda Sanders broke down in her living room, clutching the wedding photo they had thought lost forever. Sarah, reading the journal with trembling hands, finally let the tears come, not just for what had happened, but because at last the silence had given way to truth. The unearthed secret was no longer buried. The mountains had spoken. The journal, swollen from rain and warped by time, was taken to the State Forensic Lab, where specialists in document preservation began the delicate work of restoring its pages. It arrived wrapped in a soft cloth, treated not as evidence alone, but as something sacred, a final voice from the past, long silenced but not erased. The ink was faded, blurred in places by water damage and decay. Yet as they carefully separated each page, line after line began to emerge like whispers returning through the fog. A team of archivists worked tirelessly under magnified lights, using infrared scans, digital enhancement, and heat-based flattening to bring the faded writing back to life. What began as a fragmented artifact slowly revealed itself to be a chronicle, raw and intimate, a window into the final days and hours of a life that had been suspended in mystery. The earliest entries in Emily's hand were sweet, almost giddy, the kind of things a young bride might scribble when her heart was still overflowing from the joy of vows spoken and dreams beginning. She wrote of the wedding day, of Jake's hand trembling in hers as they said, "I do," of the tears in her father's eyes, of the way the stars had seemed to dance above the trees as they arrived at the cabin. She described the warmth of the fire that night, the way Jake had carried her across the threshold laughing, the scent of pine and cedar that clung to the air, and how she had never felt more complete. The tone was light, lyrical, as if she were capturing happiness in ink. But after only 2 or 3 pages, a shift began to take hold, subtle at first, then more pronounced. Like a creeping shadow across the pages, one entry recounted as strange. Tapping on the window just after midnight. She assumed it was a branch in the wind, until Jake opened the door and found a man standing there, soaked from the rain, claiming to be lost. He was disheveled, wearing old clothes and heavy boots, and said his truck had broken down near the base of the ridge. Emily described his eyes as cold, mismatched in color, one slightly clouded, and noted how he never once looked her in the face. Jake, ever trusting and kind, offered him a warm place to sit by the fire and a hot cup of tea. Emily wrote, "I told Jake I had a bad feeling. I know it's not kind to judge, but something about him feels wrong. He didn't give a name. He didn't take off his coat." The entry ended there, the ink jagged, as if the pen had caught on the page during a moment of hesitation. The following entries were more hurried, each filled with fragments of dread and the disintegration of what should have been a peaceful retreat. Emily mentioned the man refusing to leave, claiming the rain was too heavy and the dark too dangerous. She wrote about waking in the night to find him still awake, standing silently by the window. "Jake says we'll leave in the morning." She wrote, "I'm not sure we'll make it that long." Another page described Jake trying to talk to the man, trying to gently urge him to go, and the way his voice changed when the man refused, low, cautious, as though suddenly understanding, something that Emily had felt all along. The next words were nearly illegible, but through careful digital processing, investigators recovered a sentence that sent shivers through everyone who read it. "He said he's been watching us since the wedding." The final entries unraveled, like the fraying ends of a rope. One page had been written in near darkness, the lines crooked and overlapping. "He knows the woods," Emily wrote. "He said we'd never make it far if we ran. Jake is packing a bag now. We'll pretend to go to bed. and when he's asleep, we'll slip out. I'm leaving this journal behind, just in case. The last page was smeared with mud and possibly blood, the ink nearly destroyed. A few words remained. We're running. Jake is hurt. If someone finds this, and then nothing more. But those few words carried the weight of all that had been lost. It was no longer guesswork. It was no longer speculation. It was truth, scrawled by a woman in the final hours of her life, desperately trying to leave a trail behind. The journal was returned to Emily's family once the investigation allowed. Linda held it in both hands, as if afraid it would crumble. She spent hours reading it, touching the margins, tracing her daughter's handwriting with her fingers like she could bring her back through memory alone. Richard read it only once, then placed it in a glass case beside a photo of Emily as a child, her hair in pigtails, laughing on a swing. Walter Monroe read the entries again and again, obsessing over the gaps, haunted by the possibility that maybe, just maybe, they could have found them if they'd only known to look sooner. Sarah refused to let the journal be shelved. She took scanned copies and, with the family's blessing, began to share parts of it online. Not for fame, not for clicks, but because she believed people needed to know the truth. That this hadn't been a mystery born of drama or imagination. It had been real, raw, terrifying, and it had names dot in time. The journal became something more than evidence. It became a voice, a testimony, a way to let Emily speak across time and silence. People from all over began sending letters, some sharing similar stories of strangers at cabins, others just sending condolences. The pain didn't lessen, but it found a place to settle. Emily's words, penned in fear but anchored in love, had survived. The journal spoke not just of terror, but of bravery, of Jake shielding her in the dark, of a couple who had clung to each other until the very end. And in that story, as devastating as it was, there was something unbreakable. A thread of light, a love that even death had not erased. When the fingerprint from the rusted suitcase frame was matched to Clayton Ridge, it was as though the past finally exhaled. His name had lingered on the periphery of other crimes, mentioned in case files that had grown yellow and brittle with age, but never with enough certainty for charges to stick. He was a drifter, a man who knew how to vanish into small towns and deep forests, the kind of predator who didn't stand out until it was too late. In 2008, no one had connected him to the area around Wayland Gap, and by the time his name came up in distant law enforcement circles, it was already years after Emily and Jake had disappeared. Now, the journal, the fingerprint, and the knife brought him into the light with a clarity no one could ignore. The FBI took jurisdiction, not just because of the multi-state implications, but because Ridge's name had appeared in older cold cases scattered across Appalachia, stretching as far north as Pennsylvania and south into Georgia. His pattern was vague but chilling couples, mostly or young women traveling alone, always in or near remote woodland areas. He would show up briefly in a town, do odd jobs for cash, sleep in abandoned cabins or cars, then vanish again. He had no social security activity, no mailing address, no phone. Only a history of sealed juvenile records, a stint in federal prison for armed robbery, and a parole file filled with warnings from former caseworkers. When his fingerprint hit the database, the investigators moved quickly, scanning everything from border crossings to surveillance footage, backtracking through recent years with the grim determination of men who knew the clock had been ticking far too long. The first real lead came from a construction site in rural Kentucky. A foreman remembered a man who went by the name Clay, who worked for just 3 days before disappearing after an argument with another worker. He had left behind a pair of gloves and a name scrawled on a time card. The handwriting matched Clayton Ridge's prison documents. The FBI tracked down the coworker, who described a tall, quiet man with a strange gait and a scar above his right eyebrow. Another match. From there, the sightings trickled in a gas station security camera in Tennessee, a pawn shop in Asheville, an abandoned trailer in West Virginia where someone had scrolled, "You'll never find me," into the drywall. It was him, still alive, still running, still dangerous. The manhunt intensified. Media outlets ran the story across national channels. Wedding night killer identified after 15 years. Photos of Emily and Jake appeared again. No longer just smiling memories, but faces tied to justice long denied. The photo of Ridge, taken from his 2005 mugshot, was everywhere. His dead-eyed stare, now the symbol of a story that had haunted families and communities for over a decade. Tip lines lit up. People who had seen him, fed him, or feared him began calling in, most of them unaware who he really was at the time. One woman, a waitress in a diner just outside Roanoke, recalled a man who came in every Wednesday for coffee, always paid in crumpled dollar bills, and never spoke unless spoken to. Another caller claimed he had shared a campfire with someone matching Ridge's description in a state forest in North Carolina, just weeks before the journal was found. Meanwhile, the families waited. Not idly, but in that aching, suspended way that people who've endured too much pain know all too well. Linda Sanders couldn't bring herself to watch the news. She kept the television off, choosing instead to sit on the porch in the early mornings, staring at the line where the forest met the sky, hoping, dreading, praying. Walter Monroe, however, did the opposite. He devoured every update, kept a printed map of Ridge's last known sightings taped to his wall, made regular calls to the FBI, and asked questions with a steadiness that brooked no patience for delay. His son had died without a fighting chance. He would not let the man responsible die in the shadows. Then, late one evening, the breakthrough came. A wildlife camera placed by rangers in Shenandoah National Park, meant to track black bears, had picked up something else: a man, moving quietly between trees, wearing a torn green jacket and carrying what looked like a canvas rucksack. The timestamp was only 48 hours old. Local and federal teams converged. For days they scoured the area, and finally, on a misty morning as the fog clung to the ridges like wet breath, they found him in a half-collapsed lean-to made of branches and rusted tin. He did not resist. When they ordered him to the ground, he complied without a word. No weapons, no fight, only a strange, empty calm. Clayton Ridge was arrested 15 years and 4 months after Emily and Jake had vanished. The trial was swift, but not rushed. The evidence was overwhelming: the fingerprint, the journal, the items from the cabin, and most damningly, Ridge's own statements. Though he never fully confessed, he said enough under interrogation to leave no doubt. "They ran," he said once. "Didn't get far. Should have stayed inside." He gave no reason, no apology, only those cold, sparse words. Prosecutors brought in psychologists who described him as a malignant narcissist, a man with no empathy, whose crimes were rooted in control and opportunism. He had chosen Emily and Jake not for who they were, but because they were alone, and he had needed a place to stay that night. That was all it took. When the verdict was read guilty on all counts of first-degree murder, there was no outburst, no applause, only tears. Quiet, deep, exhausted tears. Linda clutched Sarah's hand, her knuckles white. Walter Monroe sat, motionless, eyes closed, his lips barely moving in a whisper that only he could hear. Ridge was sentenced to life without parole, to be served in a maximum security facility in Virginia. He was led away in shackles, his face impassive, swallowed at last by the same system he had spent a lifetime evading. Justice, long overdue, had finally arrived. But justice, even when served, is never a cure. It doesn't bring back the stolen. years or fill the empty chairs at family dinners. It doesn't erase the sound of a daughter's laughter lost to the wind, or the ache of a father's hand reaching out to hold someone who is no longer there. Still, it matters. It speaks. And in that courtroom, beneath the weight of so much sorrow, it was enough to say, "We remember. We endured. We did not forget." When news of the verdict spread through Wayland Gap, it moved like a quiet wind through the hollows and hills, not with the explosive roar of a long-awaited justice, but with the hush of something sacred finally laid to rest. People didn't cheer in the streets or gather in celebration. Instead, they paused. They stopped mid-conversation at the diner, let their coffee grow cold on kitchen counters, stood still on porches with hands over hearts and eyes turned toward the ridge where the tragedy had begun. It wasn't that they didn't feel relief. They did. But this was a town that had learned to carry its grief with dignity, and so when justice came, they met it with reverence, as if honoring not just the lives lost, but the years that had passed. In silence dotted the chapel, where Emily and Jake had been married, someone placed a new bouquet of white lily on the steps just hours after the sentencing was announced. No one saw who left them, but by evening, others had followed suit, roses, candles, handwritten notes folded and tucked beneath the railing. One simply read, "We never stopped believing." Another, written in a child's scrawl, said, "I hope you can rest now." The wooden bench near the trailhead, where volunteers had once gathered to search for the missing couple, was freshly sanded and re-stained. A new plaque added that bore their names and the inscription, "In love, in loss, in memory." The whole town had waited 15 years for answers, but in truth, they had waited even longer for peace. For the younger generation, those who had grown up hearing whispers of the wedding night mystery, the final chapter brought both sorrow and clarity. Many had formed their own quiet rituals over the years, leaving flowers on the old cabin gate, tracing hearts in the fog on windows during late-night drives, lighting candles at the annual vigil, not because they had known the couple, but because their story had become part of the town's heartbeat. In schools, teachers used the moment to talk not just about safety or history, but about resilience and community. In churches, pastors spoke of forgiveness, not for the man who had stolen so much, but for the time lost to fear, for the bitterness that had settled in like winter frost and now needed thawing. Linda Sanders, once known for her bright laugh and garden full of zinnias, had remained mostly quiet throughout the media storm. After the trial, she returned to her modest home and began tending that garden again, pulling weeds with slow, deliberate care. Neighbors would pass by and nod, not intruding, but letting her know they were there. One morning, she stood in the middle of her backyard holding the old wedding photo that had been recovered from the suitcase. It was now framed beneath glass, the water damage visible like scars, but the image still unmistakably Emily smiling, radiant, alive. Linda touched the glass gently and whispered something no one else could hear. And in that moment, the weight she had carried for a decade and a half seemed to settle a little lower in her chest. Not gone, but no longer pressing so sharply against her ribs. Walter Monroe took a different path. In the weeks following the sentencing, he became a fixture at town council meetings and community events, speaking not of revenge but of preparation. He pushed for expanded ranger patrols, better lighting near isolated cabins, and a volunteer program for keeping trails safe. He believed deeply and fiercely that what had happened to his son and Emily should never happen to another soul again. His grief was still there, etched into his posture, into the pauses between his words, but he had found a new purpose in making sure the echo of this tragedy didn't just fade into lore. People listened. They respected him. And slowly, under his guidance, Wayland Gap began to heal not just in spirit, but in structure. The discovery and trial brought renewed attention to the region, and not all of it was welcome. Podcasters came with microphones and probing questions. True crime authors arrived hoping for exclusive details. And a streaming service even offered to produce a dramatized documentary. But the community stood firm. The families issued a joint statement through the sheriff's office. This is not a story for entertainment. This is a memory, a life, a loss. Please honor it as such. The sheriff, a soft-spoken man named Carson Duval, who had been a deputy during the original investigation, gave only one press conference. In it, he said, "We are grateful for closure, but our hearts remain heavy. Emily and Jake were ours. Their story ends here, with truth and remembrance, not with spectacle." As autumn deepened, the forest that had once held so many secrets became a place of gathering. On the first Sunday of November, the community held a memorial service at the chapel, attended by hundreds. The pews were full, the air scented with pine and candle wax, and beneath the arched windows, golden light filtered through leaves that glowed like fire. Sarah stood at the pulpit and read from Emily's journal, choosing one of the earliest entries, the one where she had written about love and laughter and the way the mountain breeze had carried their joy into the trees. Her voice trembled only once. Afterward, music played and people lit candles in silence, placing them along the aisle until the chapel glowed with a soft, living light. Even in homes where life had moved on, the story continued to stir quiet conversations. At kitchen tables, grandparents told the tale to wide-eyed children, not to frighten them, but to remind them how precious love is, how strong people can be in the face of darkness. In the grocery store, people nodded to each other. A little longer. In the woods, hikers walked with more awareness, more reverence. The forest had changed, not physically, but spiritually. It was no longer just the place where Emily and Jake had disappeared. It was the place where they had been found, where truth had been recovered, and where a town had proven that time cannot erase love or silence justice. The echoes of Emily and Jake lingered not as ghost stories, but as a melody carried on wind through branches, a presence in the hush of the trail at dusk, a reminder that even the most painful endings can give rise to something sacred. And though the grief would never fully vanish, it had become something the town could hold not as a burden, but as a memory, as a lesson, as a legacy. And in the soft hush of mountain twilight, you could almost hear it. The laughter of a bride, the voice of her husband, the echo of a love that never truly left. The first snowfall came earlier than expected that year, drifting down over Wayland Gap in soft, slow flurries that coated rooftops and tree limbs like powdered sugar. It settled gently on the path that led into the woods, blanketing the trail. Where Emily and Jake had once walked, now newly marked with a discreet wooden sign, Memorial Grove. There were no flashing lights or carved monuments, just a quiet plaque near a grove of evergreens that read, "In remembrance of love enduring, and lives never forgotten." And it was there, in that hush of new snow and old memories, that healing, slow and uncertain, began to take root in the town that had held its breath for 15 long years. For Linda Sanders, healing came not in large gestures or sudden revelations, but in the quiet routines she had once abandoned. She began baking again, the scent of cinnamon and apples filling her small kitchen on Sunday mornings. She brought cookies to the church, left loaves of banana bread on neighbors' porches, not with notes or explanations, but simply as offerings. Her garden, once overrun with weeds, began to bloom again, even in the final weeks of autumn. She knelt in the dirt with hands weathered and steady, planting bulbs for spring. As she worked, she spoke softly to Emily, telling her about the neighbor's new baby, the return of the Fox family near the fence line, the way the wind had changed. There was still a hollow in her chest that would never fully close, but now it no longer ached with every breath. It simply existed, like a scar that time had learned to live with. Walter Monroe found his healing in movement, in work, in the steady rhythm of purpose. He helped organize a scholarship fund in Jake's name, aimed at students with dreams of forestry, wildlife conservation, or search and rescue training. He loved these mountains, Walter said at the fund's launch event, his voice rough, with emotion, and he would have wanted to protect them, to make them safe for others. Contributions poured in from across the country, from people who had followed the case, from former classmates, from strangers who simply wanted to help. The fund became a living tribute, something that turned grief into growth, loss into legacy. Every time Walter read the list of donors, he felt Jake close by, not in pain, not in fear, but as a present strong, kind, and unshakable. Sarah, forever, changed by the rediscovery of her best friend's story, poured her energy into creating something lasting. With permission from both families, she began writing a book, not a sensational retelling, but a personal, human account of who Emily and Jake had been, of the love they shared, of the way their story had touched so many lives. She spent her days collecting photos, interviewing old teachers, neighbors, even the first responders who had searched for them back in 2008. The process was painful, yes, but also redemptive. Each word she typed helped her make peace with the years of not knowing, with the helplessness that had haunted her. She called the manuscript Evergreen Light, a name inspired by Emily's journal entry about the cabin's lantern glowing against the trees that first night. She wanted readers to remember them not for how they died, but for how they lived, for the beauty they brought into the world even in their final hours. And then there was the town itself. Wayland Gap had always been close-knit, but in the months following the trial, something deeper began to bloom among its people. Volunteers rebuilt the old wedding cabin, not to rent it out or commercialize the memory, but to preserve it as a place of reflection. The new structure used wood from the original beams where possible, and inside they placed 2 rocking chairs side by side, facing the forest. Visitors could come, sit, and listen. No tours, no narration, just a space to be still. The community also organized an annual Day of Kindness on October 12th, the day Emily and Jake were married. People were encouraged to do one generous thing, anonymously if they wished. Some delivered groceries to the elderly, others paid for strangers. Meals at the diner, still others left notes of encouragement taped to lockers or car windshields. The idea was simple but powerful. Love outlives cruelty. And that message resonated more deeply than any punishment or prison ever could. Even the forest seemed to breathe easier. The trail where their bodies had been found was maintained now, not as a tourist attraction, but as a place of serenity. Rangers cleared fallen branches, added benches, and installed discreet lights that glowed just enough to guide the way. In spring, wildflowers bloomed where the underbrush had once grown wild. Hikers often reported hearing birdsong there even. In the quietest seasons, and one woman said she felt as though someone had walked beside her for part of the path, though she never saw a soul. Whether these things were coincidence or something more, no one tried to define. They simply accepted it. Some wounds do not heal with time alone, but through memory, through honor, through love returned tenfold by a community that refuses to let pain have the final word. And so, healing began. Not quickly, not without tears, but gently, like dawn. Breaking after a long night, the light creeping slowly across floorboards and faces, touching what had once been hidden in darkness. Children who had grown up with the story of the vanished couple now knew the truth, and in knowing, they grew. Wiser, more compassionate. Parents taught them not just to be careful in the woods, but to be kind in the world. That even a stranger's smile might mask danger, but more importantly, that every person deserves to feel safe, to be loved, to come home. There were still hard days, Moments when Linda would find herself reaching for the phone to call Emily, or when Walter would forget and set out 2 plates at the table. But now, those moments were wrapped in memory, not despair. They were reminders of something precious, something that had been taken, yes, but never destroyed. And as the seasons changed once more and the hills turned gold and crimson and then white again, Wayland Gap stood not as a place haunted by tragedy, but as a town that had faced the worst and answered with grace. Healing had begun, not perfectly, not completely, but undeniably. And in that healing was a promise that the story of Emily and Jake would not end in fear, but in love. 15 years to the day after Emily and Jake exchanged vows beneath the soft light of October trees, the chapel in Wayland Gap opened its doors once again. This time, there were no bridesmaids adjusting bouquets or groomsmen straightening ties. No laughter echoing from the back pews or nervous pacing by the altar. But there was light, the same golden afternoon glow that had once kissed the hillside, filtering through the chapel's stained glass in warm ripples. It danced across wooden benches, polished smooth by time and memory, and it touched the faces of those who had come not to witness a beginning, but to honor a love that had never truly ended. The bells rang softly, not in celebration, but in remembrance. And with each chime, it was as if the air itself whispered their names. Linda Sanders sat near the front, her hands folded around a small bouquet of wildflowers tied with a pale ribbon. They weren't from a florist, but from her garden zinnias and marigolds, rosemary and lavender. Each stem had been chosen with care, each one a symbol. She wore a dress that Emily had once said made her look like a summer sky, and on her lap rested the journal, now bound in soft leather, its pages preserved with gentle reverence. Next to her sat Sarah, holding a copy of the just-printed book, Evergreen Light. It had been released the week before and was already finding its way into libraries, bookshops, and the hands of people who needed to believe that love could endure, even through loss. Walter Monroe stood near the altar, a quiet strength in his posture, his eyes scanning the room as if searching for the boy who had once laughed in these very walls. He imagined Jake standing beside him, tie crooked, cheeks flushed with happiness, hands slightly trembling with nervous energy. In that imagined moment, Walter didn't see a son stolen, but a life that had burned brightly, fiercely, beautifully. He held nothing now but a single pinnacone, weathered and small, something Jake had once given him during a hike as a child, saying, "It's perfect. Dad, look how it spirals, like the whole forest in your hand." That pinnacone, long forgotten, in a drawer, had resurfaced only recently. And now it sat in Walter's palm, full circle, a memory made tangible. As the ceremony began, there was no minister, no formal script. Instead, people rose one by one to share stories, not just of the tragedy, but of the couple themselves. A childhood friend spoke of how Emily once stood up to a group of boys teasing a smaller girl in school, refusing to let cruelty pass unchallenged. A neighbor recalled how Jake had built a birdhouse for her grandmother the summer before he disappeared, sanding the wood so smooth she swore no rain could touch it. A retired ranger, now bent with age, shared how he had searched those woods for days, and though they hadn't found them back then, he always believed they were close, always hoped he might hear laughter through the trees. And when the journal was read aloud, just a single page, Emily's words about the way Jake had looked at her on their wedding night, there was not a dry eye in the room. Her voice, carried by the reader, reached out through time with the same softness and grace she had once lived by. Outside, the breeze picked up, stirring the leaves into a gentle dance across the stone path. A new tree had been planted near the chapel steps, a sugar maple, its branches still young but already reaching skyward. Beneath it lay a simple stone etched with both their names and the inscription, "Together in love, found in truth, remembered forever." Visitors walked past it slowly, some placing hands on the bark, others leaving flowers or folded notes. It wasn't a grave. Emily and Jake's ashes had been scattered near the grove where they were found, at the family's quiet request. But the tree was a symbol, a promise that their story would grow, that new life would rise from what had once been heartbreak. In the weeks and months that followed, something shifted not just in Wailing Gap, but in those who had followed the story from afar. Letters poured in from people across the country, teachers who read Evergreen Light aloud in classrooms, hikers who paused to say a quiet prayer at trailheads, couples who renewed their vows with a deeper appreciation for time. One woman wrote, "Your daughter reminded me to hold my husband's hand, even in the grocery store. Your son made me tell my kids I love them every night. Thank you for letting us know them." Another simply wrote, "Because of them, I found my way back to hope." For Linda, healing became legacy. She started a small writing group at the local library, helping others record their memories, believing that no life, no matter how short, should fade without being remembered. Sarah continued speaking at universities and community centers, sharing the story not as a cautionary tale, but as a testament to resilience, to truth, to the way love can outlive even the deepest darkness. Walter helped lead conservation efforts in the national parks, advocating for ranger funding and trail safety, channeling his grief into action with the kind of steadfast commitment his son would have admired. And still, every October 12th, the chapel bells rang. Not loud, not in mourning, but as a soft echo through the mountains, a heartbeat against the sky. Locals and strangers alike would walk the trail to the grove, where the trees now stood like sentinels and the earth held the silence of stories told. They brought candles, photos, sometimes just themselves, and in that space where sorrow and peace now coexisted, they remembered. They remembered the laughter, the love, the night that had once gone so terribly wrong, and the years that followed when hope seemed impossible. But more than anything, they remembered that even the cruelest silence can be broken, that truth can be unearthed, and that love, when it is real, leaves a trail that no time, no shadow, no evil can ever erase. And so, the circle closed not with an ending, but with a beginning anew. Emily and Jake had not returned to live out their days as they once dreamed, but they had been found, known, honored. Their story had passed from myth to memory to meaning, touching lives far beyond the place where it began. And in the rustling of leaves, in the hush of chapel halls, in the glow of lanterns against darkened paths, their love lived on quietly, eternally, full circle. Asterisk. Thank you so much for joining me on this unforgettable journey. Wedding night gone. Wrong 15 years later. A hiker discovers this was more than just a story of mystery and loss. It was a testament to how love, memory, and truth can endure through even the darkest moments. If this story moved you, if it made you pause and think about the people you cherish or the power of time and healing, then I'm truly honored to have shared it with you. If you haven't already, please consider subscribing to the channel. It helps more than you know and allows us to keep bringing you powerful, thought-provoking stories like this one. Don't forget to give this video a like if it resonated with you, and leave a comment below. I'd love to hear your thoughts, your feelings, or maybe even a personal story this reminded you of. Your voice matters here, and this community grows stronger when we share with one another. Until next time, take care of yourselves and those you love. And remember, sometimes the quietest stories are the ones that stay with us the longest. Thank you for watching.